Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for our final Lunch and Learn for the year. Our 2024 annual theme is Waging Peace. This year, we looked at the many different ways that President Eisenhower worked towards a global peace. This month is dedicated to studying President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. And today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Robey of Idaho State University. Dr. Robey, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Samantha, I'm getting a little bit of feedback, but it seems to have resolved itself. Never mind. So everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me to the Eisenhower Library, and thanks to the Eisenhower Foundation for inviting me as well. So I'm Dr. Sarah Robey. My expertise is in the history of nuclear science and technology. And in particular, I focus on American politics, citizenship, and American culture in relationship to nuclear technologies. So I was very excited to come present for you all today on Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. I do want to give a quick thank you to all of the people in the audience, either virtually or in person. It's great that you were able to come out today. And then in particular, I'd like to thank Joy Murphy for being very patient in helping me get this scheduled, and Samantha Pryor, especially for helping to make sure that the technology goes off without a hitch. As you all can see, I'm traveling right now. I'm at a conference, but I'm so glad to be here. And I'm going to start my timer so that I can keep an eye on how long I'm going. So on December 8th, 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower delivered a striking address to the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. Unveiling a new call for openness about nuclear science, Eisenhower argued that nuclear weapons, quote, must be put into the hands of those who will know how to strip their military casing and adapt them to the art of peace, end quote. The proposal represented a shift in foreign policy that seemed to back away from the aggressive nuclear proliferation and international and domestic secrecy that had characterized the years leading up to December 1953. In a moment, I'm going to play a few short clips of the speech, but let's situate this moment in history just a little bit. In December 1953, Eisenhower had been president for just less than 1 year. Eisenhower's first year in office was profoundly shaped by the geopolitics of the early Cold War. Shortly after his inauguration the previous January, Joseph Stalin, longtime leader of the Soviet Union, died, ushering in a period of flux across the communist world. One direct consequence of this was the armistice that ended the Korean War in July. Nuclear weapons, too, dominated international and domestic news that year. By 1953, of course, both the Soviet Union and the United States had a robust arsenal of atomic weapons. The tests of these weapons were publicized and celebrated in the news. And to put it simply, to many observers, the end of the nuclear arms race was nowhere in sight. Indeed, in 1952, just 1 year earlier, the United States had just tested their first thermonuclear device, which enabled weapons that we sometimes refer to as hydrogen or H-bombs or sometimes supers. It enabled weapons that could explode with the force of thousands of atomic warheads. The Soviet Union followed suit in 1953 when it tested its first thermonuclear device just 16 days after the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. And should your average American have managed to not hear about all of the above in the news, recall that this was the peak era of Duck and Cover and Bert the Turtle. Regular Americans encountered any number of the millions, literally millions of copies of civil defense pamphlets, flyers, posters, bulletins, films, all of these things over the previous several years. And all of these things reminded Americans of the very personal dangers of the Cold War. So when Eisenhower took the podium at the UN that December, he had very good reason to address the looming specter of nuclear war. The speech came to define the diplomatic posture of Eisenhower's early presidency. So the clip I'm about to play shows us two parts of the speech that will be most critical to our discussion today. They're also the parts that get cited most often when historians take a look at the significance of this speech. I edited the half-hour or so speech down into a 3-minute snippet. The first part picks up immediately after Eisenhower's preamble to the assembly, and that first section lays out the reason for his appearance at the UN. The second part of the clips is the last several minutes of the speech. So we can go ahead and play that.
I know that the American people share my deep belief that if a danger exists in the world, it is a danger shared by all. And equally, that if hope exists in the mind of one nation, that hope should be shared by all. Finally, if there is to be advanced any proposal designed to ease, even by the smallest measure, the tensions of today's world, what more appropriate audience could there be than the members of the General Assembly of the United Nations? I feel impelled to speak today in a language that, in a sense, is new. One which I, who have spent so much of my life in the military profession, would have preferred never to use. That new language is the language of atomic warfare. The atomic age has moved forward at such a pace that every citizen of the world should have some comprehension, at least in comparative terms, of the extent of this development, of the utmost significance to every one of us. Clearly, if the peoples of the world are to conduct an intelligent search for peace, they must be armed with the significant facts of today's existence. Against the dark background of the atomic bomb, the United States does not wish merely to present strength, but also the desire and the hope for peace. The coming months will be fraught with fateful decisions. In this assembly, in the capitals and military headquarters of the world, in the hearts of men everywhere, be they governed or governors, may they be the decisions which will lead this world out of fear and into peace. To the making of these fateful decisions, the United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma, to devote its entire heart and mind to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life. I again thank the delegates for the great honor they have done me in inviting me to appear before them and enlisting me so courteously. Thank you.
All right, so how did Eisenhower propose to have the nation, quote, devote its entire heart and mind to finding the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life? That line, much repeated. There was even a postage stamp created, with an abbreviated version of this quote. I edited the speech down for time's sake today, but the parts that I cut out lay out a very specific plan for two things. First, Eisenhower called for the creation of an international stockpile for uranium and other fissionable materials, one that all of the major powers could contribute to or would contribute to, including the Soviet Union. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. Relatedly, and secondly, Eisenhower also called for the creation of an international agency that could facilitate the sharing of nuclear scientific expertise and would be in charge of managing that fuel stockpile. Eisenhower saw this international body as a way for nations to explore, quote, the peaceful pursuits of mankind, which included agriculture, medicine, and electricity. Thus, he went on, the contributing powers would be dedicating some of their strength to serve the needs rather than the fears of mankind. Right? So essentially what Eisenhower is proposing is if we pursue atoms for peace, right, the namesake, that we can, as a global community, work ourselves out of the kind of atomic dilemma that we found ourselves in, this very scary situation. The Atoms for Peace speech mirrored an idea that had undergirded public discussions about nuclear weapons since literally the day after Hiroshima. And that's that the future of the world depended on the responsible use of nuclear science for the betterment and not the destruction of mankind. Fast forwarding a number of years, placed in the context of 1953, Eisenhower resurrected this idea excuse me, and urged the international community to see the peaceful uses of nuclear science as a solution to the monumental dangers of the Cold War. So at face value, the Atoms for Peace speech is a renewed call for international nuclear cooperation, at least over matters of peaceful nuclear uses. Indeed, the speech initiated a series of critical changes in the United States and in international policy that, among other things, established the International Atomic Energy Agency and established commercial nuclear power production in the United States and elsewhere. But, as any historian can tell you, the history here is much more complicated than all of that. Accordingly, I would argue, there are other ways to understand the speech's significance. To me, Atoms for Peace represents the confluence of several aligning interests and efforts that predated December 1953. And it's these varied interests that will form the contours of the rest of today's talk. So first, Eisenhower and his advisors understood the Atoms for Peace campaign, so both the speech and the actions that followed it. They understood that as having the potential to build trust among the American people, and they hoped it would increase public confidence in and support for Cold War policies. Secondly, Eisenhower and his advisors understood that the sharing of nuclear knowledge for peaceful purposes had value on the international stage. Not only could the US claim the moral high ground of promoting peace in this way, but American policymakers saw an opportunity to perhaps cultivate allies among unaligned nations, particularly those in the developing world. And then third, the final point I'll discuss today will explain how Atoms for Peace continued an established tradition of framing nuclear science as a force for good rather than destruction. If we think of Atoms for Peace as some form of nuclear boosterism, like to be a booster, the campaign can be understood as a public relations effort to set the stage for a civilian nuclear power industry in the United States. And then, of course, by way of conclusion, I'll also attempt to offer some thoughts looking back at the legacy of Atoms for Peace today. All right, so when Eisenhower entered office in early 1953, it had been nearly 8 years since the United States attacked Japan with 2 atomic bombs, ushering in the end of World War II. For 4 years after that, from 1945 until 1949, the United States was the sole custodian of the world's atomic arsenal. That, of course, ended in August of 1949 when the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb, ending what we often call the American nuclear monopoly. And in fact, Eisenhower uses that language in the UN speech. As I mentioned earlier, it was only a matter of years before both superpowers were building thermonuclear weapons, bigger weapons. So across nearly all of this post-war history in the United States, one single agency controlled all nuclear development. And that, of course, is the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC. The AEC was created in 1949 to replace the wartime Manhattan Project. And as the vested control in nuclear energy in the United States, the AEC had near total control over nuclear research, weapons development, fissionable material, and related operations. The Commission also enforced policies of strict secrecy among its employees and answered only to a small set of security-cleared lawmakers in Congress. When the AEC released public information, such as that which they gave to the Civil Defense Administration I mentioned earlier, that information was always completely need to know, and it was pretty unspecific. Given the growing hostilities of the Cold War in the late 1940s, fears of domestic communist infiltration, and evidence of World War II era atomic espionage, the AEC's omnipotence and secrecy and relative autonomy makes sense, right? Makes sense in that context. But by the early 1950s, some critics expressed alarm at the power of the AEC. After all, this was the United States, a nation that valued participatory democracy, elected officiating, and government transparency. This was not the Soviet Union, a place where most Americans associated with totalitarianism and government secrecy. In the course of research for my first book, I found that some of the most clearly articulated critiques of this type emerged when President Truman announced that the United States would pursue the development of thermonuclear weapons. He announced this in 1950. One editorial said, quote, "The very ambiguity of the secrecy which continues to hang like a shroud over matters of atomic energy and the direction of its employment is something to dismay all reflective citizens," end quote. A number of prominent scientists at the time also expressed concern, saying they are concerned, quote, "they are concerned about the dangers of making such decisions by a limited group of men under such secretive conditions," end quote. Eisenhower and his closest advisors were all too aware of the power of these criticisms. Shortly after entering office, Eisenhower received a National Security Council report that made wide-ranging recommendations about curbing the frightening trends of proliferation and weapons advancement. The authors of the report, however, were driven by a belief that the first necessary change that Eisenhower needed to make was to open the channels of communication with the American people about what they called the meaning of the arms race. The report concluded that, quote, "in a democracy, an informed public is the best safeguard against extreme public reactions," end quote. Upon reading and reviewing the report, Eisenhower became convinced of the long-term value of governing transparency in his presidency, thus starting a policy effort called Operation Candor. So with candor in mind, by February 1953, Eisenhower announced a new look for foreign policy. In addition to intentionally differentiating himself from his predecessor, which is a useful tool for any incoming president, Eisenhower's new look also included a host of policy objectives. They included both military and non-military modes of waging the Cold War. It included the management of international influence and prestige, domestic economic growth, and importantly, the management of American public opinion. Okay, so in all of that context of candor, of new looks, of fresh starts over the course of 1953, in that context, Atoms for Peace makes even more sense, right? The speech illustrates a set of straightforward truths about the arms race. Invoking the priorities of Operation Candor, Eisenhower says, quote, if the peoples of the world are to conduct an intelligent search for peace, they must be armed with the significant facts of today's existence," right? We heard that. By insisting that the American and indeed the global public could handle such difficult information, Eisenhower offered a new approach to the communication relationship between the American state and its citizens. Though Atoms for Peace revealed nothing close to a state secret, the general vibe of the speech presented a much different kind of messaging than the buttoned-up communiques from the Atomic Energy Commission and the Truman administration before him. Perhaps most significantly, Eisenhower issued a moral imperative that the United States be a leader in the pursuit of peace. During the second half of Truman's presidency, the consistent message to American citizens about nuclear weapons was that, one, the United States had the obligation to continue building its weapons of war in order to prevent an attack on U.S. soil. Secondly, the Truman administration told Americans that they, the citizens themselves, had a moral imperative to protect themselves if war ever came. Again, here I'm referencing duck and cover and the like. Eisenhower's messaging at the UN was a new look. It was a new outlook. And indeed, several developments in 1954 and 55, the 2 years after the UN speech, several developments followed through on Eisenhower's call for peaceful nuclear development. With Republican control of both the White House and both chambers of Congress, the Eisenhower administration easily passed legislation in 1954 that transformed the management of nuclear development in the U.S. The Atomic Energy Act of 1954 significantly eased restrictions on nuclear technical information, making it possible for the U.S. to participate in the international scientific exchange that Atoms for Peace promised. The same amendments also made it possible for private American companies to acquire the kind of technical information that would enable them to pursue the creation of domestic nuclear power plants. More on that later. In addition to some successful legislative changes, there are other hopeful things that came out of Atoms for Peace. In 1955, Eisenhower, along with leaders from the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain, met in Geneva to initiate discussions of peace and disarmament. The Geneva Summit, as it was referred to, was the first such in-person meeting of Soviet and Western powers since the Potsdam Conference a decade earlier. Ultimately, the summit didn't amount to much in terms of progress towards formal agreements. However, the summit represented a major step forward in increasing lines of communication between the superpowers on a variety of topics. These more open channels enabled future conversations. In 1958, 3 years later, despite 3 tumultuous intervening years, the superpowers returned to Geneva, this time to place a temporary moratorium on above-ground nuclear testing. The goal of the temporary order was to give the powers time to come up with a permanent testing ban. For Eisenhower at the time, a test ban seemed like the likeliest window of opportunity to start working towards his larger goals of global security. Moreover, by this time, a vocal subset of American citizens had grown concerned enough about atmospheric fallout from nuclear tests that there was a growing grassroots public support for a test ban as well. Despite several years of on-again, off-again talks for a permanent agreement, the temporary moratorium came to an end in 1961, fizzling in the wake of rising tensions in Berlin. It wouldn't be until 1963 that the nations agreed to ban the testing of nuclear weapons above ground, underwater, and in outer space. In hindsight, it's difficult to say just how much of an effect Atoms for Peace had on how Americans were thinking about nuclear weapons or nuclear technology more broadly. Public opinion polling during this era is notoriously difficult to make sense of. The studies are inconsistent and at times contradictory, in part because nuclear and Cold War developments were happening so quickly across the 1950s. But by the late 50s and early 60s, however, American public opinion about the wisdom of deterrence and nuclearization was shifting, even with the incremental gains offered by Atoms for Peace. Armed with the knowledge of the long-term consequences of fallout and the stark realization of what massive retaliation actually looks like in the thermonuclear age, it's not good, more and more Americans became disillusioned with the Cold War state and its policies. For these Americans, neither candor nor the promise of Atoms for Peace could overcome the pressing reality of atoms for war. All right, so moving on. let us return to 1953 once more to examine a different aspect of Atoms for Peace. For a variety of reasons I've just outlined, the emphasis on candor that undergirded the Atoms for Peace speech, it failed to quell public distress over the atomic age. But honestly, I don't think that's the fault of Eisenhower's efforts to be frank with the American public. Over the course of the 50s, Cold War developments, including, like I said before, awareness of the dangers of fallout, increasing nuclear stockpiles, and the constancy of overseas proxy conflicts between the Soviet Union and the US, all these things continued to fuel American fears and anxieties, and for good reason, I think. But there's another lens in which I think we can understand Atoms for Peace, and that's the global impact of the platform. As I mentioned before, by December 1953, Eisenhower and his advisors understood that the sharing of nuclear knowledge for peaceful purposes might have enormous value on the international diplomatic stage. Not only could the US claim the moral high ground of promoting peace in this way, but American policymakers also saw an opportunity to perhaps cultivate allies among unaligned nations, particularly those in the developing world. So let's take a look at these two aspects, the moral high ground side of things and the relationship to unaligned nations. So with regards to having the moral high ground, let us remember that the Cold War was a battle of ideologies and virtue as much as it was an arms race. The ideological competition of the Cold War was not just about which nation's political or economic system was wisest, it was also about which nation's political system was the most righteous. Which political system could provide its citizens with true freedom, health, prosperity, and happiness. Right? Even by the late 1940s in the United States, the term communist or communism had picked up a range of moral connotations. Right? Communism was associated with immorality, backwardness, corruption, not to mention atheism. By the early 1950s, several years later, as political and social campaigns against communism within the US reached their height, right? Think McCarthyism, mainstream cultural associations with communism took on even more dire connotations with more moral aberrance, social deviance in a variety of guises, and weakness of character, conviction, and loyalty. This is all just to say, to be an aware American citizen in the early 1950s was to be intimately familiar with the Cold War as a moral conflict. With this in mind, it makes sense that Eisenhower might lace the Atoms for Peace speech with the language of moralism. He talks about right versus wrong, of light versus dark, of hope versus fear, of decency, of justice. The text of the speech is not exactly a diatribe against the Soviet Union. Instead, Eisenhower makes allusions to the tensions of today's world and a world divided. He specifically calls out the Soviet Union a little later in the speech on their previous unwillingness to meet to discuss peace. But the point of the speech is to illustrate the harm of a nuclearized world, not necessarily pointing the finger at the Soviet Union for making it so. Remarking on the global situation, Eisenhower decries, quote, the hopeless finality of a belief that two atomic colossi are doomed malevolently to eye each other indefinitely across a trembling world. What a quote, right? Instead, he says, my country wants to be constructive, not destructive. It wants agreements, not wars among nations. I'm not the first historian to notice a note of guilt tripping that permeates this kind of idea. Eisenhower is standing in front of the nations of the world, describing the United States as unquestionably devoted to the idea of peace. And in slipping in the bit about the Soviets refusing to come to the peace-talking table, Eisenhower is positioning the United States as, for lack of a better word, the bigger person. Perhaps he and his advisors hoped such a public pronouncement might cajole the Soviet Union into reciprocating, right, into coming to the table for Atoms for Peace. Eisenhower literally says of those nations principally involved in the Atoms for Peace program, the Soviet Union must, of course, be one. That's a power move, right? For me, a historian who thinks a lot about the nature of nuclear deterrence, I see a certain parallel here. Deterrence theory, across all its many nuanced and changing forms, rests on the idea or hope of controlling one's enemy through one's own actions, right? It's kind of this logic of, if I build up my arsenal so large, my enemy will not be able to strike back or won't want to. So it follows then that if I tell the world I want peace, it'll look bad for my enemy if they don't agree with me. This idea of looking good or looking bad or performing for the world stage was also a strategy baked into this Cold War rivalry. And this brings me to my second point. The Atoms for Peace platform is also unquestionably about strengthening the United States' existing alliances and bringing unaligned nations into the fold of American influence. As other historians before me have shown, the Cold War must be thought of, at least in part, as the superpowers' quest to bring other nations into their respective spheres of influence. Throughout the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States invested incredible sums of money, arsenals of conventional weapons sales, flexed their diplomatic cachet, and spent their political chips. And in some cases, they dedicated their own soldiers to the interest of preventing an unaligned nation from falling into the sway of their rival. Many of the sites of these Cold War interventions were in nations we might refer to today as the developing world or perhaps the global south. In the 1950s, a new term was emerging to describe unaligned or unallied parts of the world, and that's called the Third World. That's where that term comes from. Most of the nations bearing this name were poorer, were less industrialized. Many were former colonies in Africa, Southern and Southeastern Asia. And if you're not familiar with these terms, like First World meant the US and other allied nations, allied Western nations. Second World meant the Soviet Union, China, and other Eastern Bloc allies. And perhaps from that, you can figure out who came up with this terminology. But while that first, second, third world terminology was still catching on by 1953, the concept wasn't. The Korean War, after all, just recently an armistice, can be seen as a NATO-led effort to prevent the spread of communism into the Korean peninsula. But that, of course, was an intervention of force. What Eisenhower was promoting in the Atoms for Peace speech proposed a very different kind of influence. To disseminate knowledge of the peaceful atom, he argued, it would allow, quote, experts to be mobilized to apply atomic energy to the needs of agriculture, medicine, and other peaceful activities. He goes on, a special purpose would be to provide abundant electrical energy in the power-starved areas of the world, end quote. Here, there can be no doubt that Eisenhower is thinking about poorer nations and the possibility of establishing friendly relationships with nations who could benefit the most from the peaceful atom. And in the Cold War context, friendly relationships could mean formal or informal alliances, economic aid, access to markets, and pro-democracy governing tendencies, or at least American strategists hoped for that. Even if the Soviet Union joined in on the program for Atoms for Peace, the program would always bear an association with the United States. If the Soviet Union refused to opt into the program, even better, right? Or at least according to Cold Warriors, then the United States would get all or at least most of the credit. The planners, engineers, physicists, and officials carrying out Atoms for Peace objectives would likely be dominated by Americans as well. This, Eisenhower almost certainly understood, could be a critical in to establishing American involvement in such regions. In 1953, as Eisenhower is giving this speech, the kind of soft power diplomacy was well on its way to being an established tactic in waging the Cold War. Certainly, the Marshall Plan after World War II set a precedent for economic aid being restricted to allied countries. Fast forward to the 1960s, beyond Eisenhower's tenure in office, these sorts of policies and initiatives formally linked American aid to pro-American alliances. Although American aid in the form of food or other commodities could ostensibly be framed as humanitarian relief, these initiatives often came with strings attached. For many nations in need of aid, they could only receive it if their governments agreed to support American foreign policy objectives. So while that sort of strong-arming was not part of Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace plan in 1953, certainly attracting the world's nations to the American cause, and specifically Eisenhower's vision for peace, that was part of the plan. Finally, there's one other important context to Eisenhower's speech. We've talked so far about the speech's potential to speak to a worried or skeptical American public, as well as its potential to move the needle on American diplomatic goals. But I would argue that the most lasting consequence of the Atoms for Peace platform is how it spoke to the possibility of commercial nuclear power production in the United States. Indeed, Eisenhower's speech reflected many years of previous messaging about the expansive potential of peaceful nuclear energy. Since the very principle of nuclear fission was just demonstrated and discovered in the 1930s, physicists closest to this science understood that fission could be harnessed as an incredibly powerful force. In the context of Hitler's rise to power in Europe during the 30s, many of these minds immediately went to the possibility of a weapon. But alongside those predictions were more optimistic ones as well. Physicists in the 30s knew that if you could sustain and control a chain reaction, you'd be talking about massive quantities of energy released as heat. As such, early predictions for the future uses of nuclear reactions often focused on places where heat from a chain reaction could replace heat from fuel combustion. In particular, they thought of transportation and electricity. Yet even before many of these peaceful applications could be developed and put into practice, American industrial corporations began promoting the peaceful atom through a variety of media. To take one example, we might look at comic books, like the one you see here, or sponsored film, both of which are genres that I've written about previously. Sponsored films, in particular in the 1940s and 50s, about atomic energy were almost universally framed as scientific education for a general audience. Today, we might call them edutainment, education and entertainment. The ones that talked about nuclear science were pretty boosterish as well. They were heavily promoted the peaceful nuclear future. The films intentionally drew the viewer's attention away from nuclear weapons and towards a future of prosperity, health, peace, continued material abundance, and inexpensive energy, all thanks to nuclear science. In doing so, the film's writers, producers, and sponsors worked to reinforce a narrative that nuclear science was a force for good at a moment when many Americans had only ever considered the consequences of its forces for not good, for destruction. Existing energy industries and those adjacent to them were prominent among the firms that sponsored films. From the late 1940s on, corporations such as General Electric, Standard Oil, Monsanto, Westinghouse, and Union Carbide all commissioned films that in one way or another promoted the peaceful atom. One of the earliest and most successful, however, was General Electric's 1953 film, A is for Atom. The basic premise of this film is this. Filmmakers say that although the atomic age was born from a moment of incredible destruction, it actually offered us a giant genie, like kind of literally, you can see in the animations, a genie with limitless power that is at man's command. I'll share just a snippet of the early narration of the film. So in voiceover, the narrator says, quote, "All men of goodwill earnestly hope that a realistic control of atomic weapons can and will be achieved." End quote. But until then, the narrator insists, quote, "Wisdom demands that we take time to understand this force, because here, in fact, is the answer to a dream as old as man himself, a giant of limitless power at man's command." End quote. So taking out all the business of the giant, how familiar does this sound, right? Just as an aside, the film then goes on through a delightful cartoon primer explaining the periodic table of elements and what fission is and what chain reactions are and how radioactive isotopes are already being used or could be used in the future. You can find it on YouTube if you're curious. The film ends by admitting that the atomic giant is not one, but many benevolent giants, right? That last screenshot on the slide. And these benevolent giants are poised to make the world a much better place. And now, today, I think we forget how popular a film reel like this could have been in the 1950s. This one in particular reached millions of Americans in the years after its release, and also won several film industry awards. Okay, so why have we taken this side quest into the land of kitschy nuclear boosterism? A is for Atom came out in February 1953, just a month after Eisenhower's inauguration. Am I suggesting that Eisenhower lifted policy points from a general education short film? Absolutely not. What I am arguing is that this kind of technological optimism about nuclear science was pervasive in the early 1950s. And I am arguing that this kind of messaging had a lot of power. What the Eisenhower administration did was put this kind of nuclear boosterism to work in the interest of diplomacy. By the time Eisenhower appeared at the UN, it was nuclear electricity that had made the most progress from being a hypothetical principle to a concrete reality. In 1951, scientists at the National Reactor Testing Station in my home state of Idaho conclusively demonstrated that nuclear electricity was possible when they hooked up a small circuit of light bulbs you can see here to a steam generator heated by a nuclear reactor. Yet the restrictions of the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, right, the one that created the Atomic Energy Commission and its tight control over nuclear information and materials, within the bounds of that act, there existed no way to build widespread nuclear power plants for civilian use. Unless you count, maybe the Atomic Energy Commission could build, staff, guard, and regulate its own power plants, which comes with the thorny subject of whether the federal state should be in the business of selling electricity. So, simply put, existing law in 1953 had no way to enable commercial nuclear power. But as I mentioned before, one of the concrete immediate outcomes of the Atoms for Peace speech was that Congress amended the Atomic Energy Act in 1954. Not only did the amendment make it legally permissible for the U.S. to share some, but not all, nuclear information with other nations, it also made it possible for private companies to acquire the expertise necessary to build, operate, and manage nuclear power plants. By the time the act was amended, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Eisenhower administration were eager to promote the idea domestically. In an often cited quote from 1954 from Lewis Strauss, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Strauss said, quote, "It's not too much to expect that our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter. They will know of great periodic regional famines in the world only as matters of history. They will travel effortlessly over the seas and under them and through the air with a minimum of danger and at great speeds, and will experience a lifespan far longer than ours, as disease yields and man comes to understand what causes him to age. This is a forecast for an age of peace." Electricity too cheap to meter, the end of famine, right? Effortless transportation, long life. Americans had been hearing these promises for years, and for some, that allure was intoxicating. That was certainly the case for the Atomic Energy Commission, which wanted to quickly demonstrate the feasibility of grid-scale nuclear power to attract corporate investors. Working with the Duquesne Light Company in Western Pennsylvania, the AEC rushed to construct the nation's first full-scale electricity plant powered by a nuclear reactor. The Shippingport Atomic Power Station reached criticality on December 2nd, 1957, just 6 days shy of the 4-year anniversary of the Atoms for Peace speech. And as an aside, can you imagine any power plant going online in less than 4 years, much less the first large-scale application from a new energy source? Kind of boggles the mind. As many of you know, though, despite the early excitement and enthusiasm that got shipping port online in 1957, nuclear power has had a rocky road in the United States. When we get to the question and answer in a minute or two, I'll be happy to answer questions about the longer history of nuclear energy in this country. But for now, I'll just say this. In the decades since the 50s, enough of the American public has been concerned about this kind of atoms for peace that nuclear electricity has never lived up to the dreams of the 50s. So let me conclude. In the wake of Atoms for Peace, during the remainder of Eisenhower's presidency and beyond, the U.S. continued to build its nuclear arsenal, both in terms of number of weapons and their relative destructiveness. Headlines about developments in Geneva that foretold peace or disarmament ran alongside news headlines about successful nuclear tests in Nevada and in the Marshall Islands. The Eisenhower administration saw little contradiction in this. Short of a watertight agreement that would hold both the Soviet Union and the United States to their disarmament promises, which of course never happened, Cold War officials felt they had no choice but to further entrench themselves in a structure of deterrence based on growing and maintaining their arsenals. For nuclear historians like myself, it's astounding how frequently we find in our sources examples of the tension between atoms for peace and atoms for war. Eisenhower was not the first high-profile official to discuss this binary system, to use it as a persuasive technique, or to craft policy around it. Nor was he the last official to do so. In our almost 80-year history in the atomic age, many pundits, scientists, activists, and politicians have had reasons to draw a stark contrast, a stark distinction between good and bad atoms. But time and time again, historical primary sources remind us that everyday people rarely saw the two categories as entirely separate. For many Americans, the first time they had cause to think about anything related to particle physics was in the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima. To get the public to move away from the association between nuclear or atomic and the word weapon has often been close to impossible, and trust me, many nuclear officials and scientists and engineers have tried. For new generations of Americans that did not grow up under the shadow of the bomb, nuclear and atomic now have equally discouraging associations with contamination and toxicity, even sometimes appearing alongside the acknowledgement that nuclear power might be a solution to some of today's most pressing energy challenges. So what might Eisenhower say about the legacy of Atoms for Peace? And what would he say today? Objectively, it's kind of a mixed bag. The international effort to share nuclear knowledge led to dozens of nuclear power plants being constructed in nations that did not have their own homegrown nuclear energy program. Today, the IEAE persists as an agency that still seeks to promote peaceful uses of the atom, but in practice spends a lot of its time developing nuclear safeguards and investigating possible misuses of nuclear materials. Domestically, the US eventually generated about 20% of its electricity from nuclear power. We are just under that number today. By those metrics, one might say that Atoms for Peace reached some of its stated goals. But for Eisenhower, a person who had deep-seated concerns about Cold War militarization, I suspect he might be disappointed by how little Atoms for Peace did in the long run to curb proliferation. Despite over 30 years since the end of the Cold War, our best estimates estimate that there are over 12,000 nuclear warheads on the planet still. This is obviously a significant step down from the number that the world had in the mid-1980s, which was probably close to about 70,000 nuclear warheads. But there are still enough nuclear weapons in existence to cause a global-scale catastrophe if ever used in war. And unfortunately, some of our most complicated international conflicts still involve, to some degree, the threat of nuclear weapons. But in the end, I'm a historian, right? And so I'm more inclined to ask the question, what did Atoms for Peace mean at the time, than I am to ask the question, what did Atoms for Peace mean 70 years later? I hope that today I've given you a few new ways to understand Atoms for Peace, both as a context, as a product of its context, and as a product of Eisenhower's long quest to wage peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Robey. Testing. No. Testing. There we go. Thank you so much, Dr. Robey. At this time, we'll see if there are any questions in the audience, from the audience. I'll come to you. Just wave your hand. Go.
How many nuclear plants are providing power in the United States?
Could you say that again? I couldn't quite hear it.
She said, how many nuclear plants are providing power in the United States today?
I believe that number is somewhere in the 90s of active nuclear power plants. At the height, I think that number was like 112 sometime in the mid 90s. President Nixon in the early 70s predicted that there would be 1,000 nuclear power plants in the US by the year 2000, and we've never come close to that.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, the question is, how many plants are not in use today?
I don't know what the number is. I'm not sure what the number is in terms of plants that have been decommissioned. The Energy Information Agency run by the US government keeps really great statistics of that. I will say one thing that I thought about including today, but I ran over time already, was that since Shippingport in 1957, over half of the nuclear power plants that have been proposed and even initially licensed never came online. And a lot of that had to do with budget overruns as well as intense public pushback. So it doesn't quite answer your question, but I think it is important to note that nuclear power has had a really hard road in terms of being a fully integrated part of our energy infrastructure. And certainly a lot of the existing plants today are quite old, right? They were probably built in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. And over time, some of them do need to be decommissioned.
I wonder how I could think about our continuing discussions about atomic weapons with other nations that we still don't seem to be able to resolve or move forward on anything.
Yeah, I think Atoms for Peace, there were some incremental gains over the 50s and 60s. Notably, there was a test ban treaty signed in 1963, and that laid some of the framework for later arms agreements. But they've never been quite as extensive. The arms agreements have never been quite as extensive as I would like to think Eisenhower hoped for. They've been really incremental, and ultimately they are things of politics, which means that treaties can be ignored based on political whims or new needs of individual nations, new ambitions of individual nations. So yeah, I agree. Like it's, we've never quite figured it out.
Any other questions? None? Okay, I don't see any questions online either. A little bit of a quiet audience today. Okay, all right. Well, then we will wrap this up. Thank you so much, Dr. Robey, for your wonderful presentation. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you all for having me. I regret I couldn't be there to see your faces, but thank you.
All right, to everyone else in the building. So firstly, thank you to all of you in the building and online for joining us today. We want to thank our program sponsors, the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Cook Memorial Foundation. If we didn't have them, we would not be able to put on these programs for you, so we certainly appreciate you. We want to invite you back in January of 2025 for the start of our programming year. Our theme for 2025 is a salute to veterans. So we will spend the whole year talking about different veterans. As a reminder, there are surveys on your table that will help us improve. And if you are joining us virtually, there's a link for a digital survey in the program description. As always, you can find more information about our programs on our website, eisenhowerlibrary.gov, where you can also join our mailing list. If you have been with us all year, thank you for your continued support, and we hope to see you next year. Thank you. Oh, Dr. Robey, we have one more question if you're still on.
I'm still here. Yeah, go ahead.
They want to know when and how you became interested in this topic.
Oh, that I did. When I started my PhD work, I was really interested in post-war technology and how people imagined what their future would look like in the rapid technological advancement after World War II. And pretty quickly after I started digging into that topic, I realized that it's really hard to A, talk about how people were imagining the future, or B, talk about how people were interacting with technology without thinking about nuclear weapons. And so that launched me into what is now a whole career about nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. So that's been my little niche.
Well, I would certainly appreciative of you and your niche. All right, any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for coming and have a wonderful afternoon.